So we're just getting started. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started and assume as other people sign on, they'll join us. So my name's Billy Pratt, not Dennis Neely. I wish I could be Dennis Neely, but unfortunately I cannot. But I am using his Zoom account, so that's why it looks like it's me. It says Dennis, and it's not really Dennis. Dennis is on here. He is Den USIS. I don't know what that means. But in any case, I'm excited to have all of you, and I'm really excited to get this Zoom class going. We had the first in-person session on Sunday, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. So hopefully you will enjoy this Zoom session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be sharing slides, PowerPoint slides, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to those. And about 10-15 minutes in, I'm going to be playing a 5-minute video. So, and then after the video, we'll come back to the slides. Since when I start sharing slides, I'm not going to be able to see the chat or anyone raising their hand. So what I'll do is every 5 to 10 minutes when I'm at a breaking point, I will stop sharing and go look and see if anyone has questions. The other way we can work this is if anyone does have a question and you just unmute yourself and say something, then I'll try to stop. Now, the only problem with that is if everybody does that, then we won't make any progress. So we'll figure it out as we go. And next time I'll get a laptop or something that I can put beside me where I can see the chat and see the participants and actually have it muted so that there's no feedback. So let me go ahead and start sharing the slides. Okay, so I sent out an email a few days ago asking you what you hope to get out of the class, and several of you emailed me. That was really helpful. And I'm hoping that I can fulfill your expectations for the class. And if not, that's my fault. And it's not William Lane Craig's fault, who wrote the book that we're going to study. So the book is called On Guard, Defending Your Faith with Reason and Precision by William Lane Craig. So Dr. Craig is currently, in my opinion, the top Christian academic debater in the world. He's debated, I think, over 100 skeptical scholars for the last 30 years. And his intellect is unmatched by anyone currently on the Christian scene, at least who's debating. There might be smarter Christian scholars than him, but not very many. He is kind of in a league of his own. He's a brilliant man, and every time he debates a skeptic, he wins every single debate. If you ever go to YouTube and watch any of his debates, he is outstanding at debates. So he wrote this book, On Guard, about 8 years ago, and it's sort of the simplified version of another book he wrote called Reasonable Faith. And he wrote this book to try to help Christian lay people understand the arguments that he uses in the debates he has. So these arguments in this book have been tested in battle, so to speak, for 30 years against, people with lots of PhDs in philosophy, religion, physics, so forth and so on. I mean, he only debates top-notch scholars around the world. And so the arguments in this book, the reason I like this book is because I know these arguments work against the toughest challengers in the world. So you may study arguments for God's existence from other people, but a lot of times those arguments I find to be too simplified and too watered down. And when you actually come into contact with a skeptic, they start throwing things at you and you go, uh-oh, that wasn't covered in the book. But what you'll find in this book is if you truly read the book ahead of these lectures and then listen to the lecture, you will start to learn these arguments. And they're very, very good. And they've stood up. They've stood the test of time, and they've also stood up in over 100 debates. Okay, so why study apologetics? So what I'm going to do is tonight I'm going to go through chapters 1 and 2 of the book, and then next week I'll do chapter 3. But I think we can cover 2 chapters in one night, so I didn't see any reason to separate this into 2 different sessions. So the first chapter was talking about why apologetics. So why is apologetics, which is defense of the Christian faith, important? And in the book, he offers 3 reasons: shaping culture, strengthening believers, and winning unbelievers. And so what we're going to do is briefly talk about each one of these. So shaping culture. The gospel is never heard in isolation. So if we don't engage with the culture using reason and evidence, then our culture will write off Christianity as a joke, a threat, or a mere curiosity. And in the book, he had a fun little political cartoon that you may remember, where he has these Christians over here, and they're kind of like in a zoo. And if you read the sign down here, it says "Caution, Baptists." And so in that sense, these Baptists or Christians are a threat, right? There's a sign that says "Caution." And then you have this lady and her kids sitting by the fence looking at these people, and she's curious, right? She's like, what are these people doing? Like, who are they? So I like this cartoon because in one cartoon you have Christianity portrayed as a joke, a threat, and a curiosity. So I thought it was a great cartoon. Okay, so I liked this quote from the book because I think he's making an important point here. He says, I'm not saying that people will become Christians because of the arguments and evidence. Rather, I'm saying that the arguments and evidence will help to create a culture in which Christian belief is a reasonable thing. They create an environment in which people will be open to the gospel. So becoming trained in apologetics is one way, a vital way of being salt and light in American culture today. So I think the important point is in here is a lot of people say, oh, well, you apologists think that you can argue people into the faith, right? Arguments and evidence. And, that's not what I think. And that's not what Dr. Craig thinks. It takes the Holy Spirit to convict someone and to regenerate their soul. However, these apologetic arguments do have a place in preparing that person for faith in Christ. So what about strengthening believers? So first of all, knowing why you believe as well as what you believe will make you more confident in sharing your faith with others. So, a lot of Christians don't even know what they believe, but I went to seminary to study apologetics, and interestingly, we spent 2/3 of my seminary education covering what Christians believe, and which is kind of funny because when I went to seminary, I thought we were going to spend the whole time on why, but the seminary professors rightly figured out that if our students don't know what Christianity is, what the doctrines are, then it's pointless to teach them why they believe it. But once you know what you believe, being able to explain why you believe it is important. And of course, that's commanded in the New Testament, in particular in 1 Peter. Second, apologetics can also help you to keep the faith in times of doubt and struggle. Emotions will carry you only so far, and then you're going to need something more substantial. Now, I mean, this doesn't apply to everyone. Like my mother, for example, could care less about apologetics. If you ask her what sustains her in times of trouble, she'll say, well, Billy, I've walked with Jesus for 78 years and I trust him and I don't need your silly arguments. And that's great for my mother, but that doesn't work for me. I'm not a particularly emotional person. And for me, my intellect has to be engaged. And when I have struggles, when I have doubts about Christianity or just about life in general, I fall back on these arguments all the time. On the arguments for the existence of God, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I personally fall back on these arguments constantly and have been doing that for 15 years. And so I think some of you may find that to be a similar help. All right, so what about winning unbelievers? Several of you that emailed me mentioned that you have people in your lives, whether they be family members or coworkers or friends, who are, intellectual, who are smart people. And when you try to share the gospel with them, they start throwing all kinds of objections at you. And that was exactly my experience. When I was in my early 30s, I was trying to witness to electrical engineers with master's degrees and PhDs where I worked. And they had all kinds of arguments and evidence against Christianity that I could not hope to even begin to respond to. And in fact, that's what partially drove me into learning these arguments, is because everyone I worked with who was not a Christian was challenging me, and they wouldn't listen to me unless I provided evidence and arguments. So there are some people that need evidence and arguments, and these people can be reached with apologetics. And these people may be a minority, but they are typically very influential. C.S. Lewis is a good example. He needed arguments and evidence, and he famously was influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien and others like him who gave him arguments and evidence. And eventually the Holy Spirit got a hold of C.S. Lewis and converted him to Christianity, I believe in his 30s. And of course, C.S. Lewis has gone on to be arguably the most influential Christian writer of the 20th century. I mean, he's at least in the top 5. I think he's number 1, but that's just my opinion. So just a rhetorical question for you, do you know anyone like this? Do you know people that need evidence and arguments? And I'm guessing a lot of you do. And that's why you signed up for this class, is because you know people like this. And you find that when you witness to them, it's very difficult. They are demanding that you give them evidence and arguments. Okay, I will pause in just a couple more minutes before we go into Life is Absurd Without God, which is chapter 2. So I'm going to pause in just a minute. So the arguments in the book, especially the first 5 or 6 chapters, are typically deductive arguments. So they consist of several statements called premises. So each statement is a premise. And if all the premises are true, then the conclusion logically follows. So this is what deductive arguments are. Now, a skeptic can always deny one or more of the premises. But the goal is to provide good evidence for all the premises so that the skeptic pays a high intellectual price for their denial. One of the things that frustrated me when I first learned these arguments 15, 20 years ago, is I would present them to friends and family, and I thought that the premises were pretty obvious and that they would agree with them, and they would follow along to the conclusion I was about to give them. But I found that every premise that I ever gave people was always challenged and in many times denied. And so, Dr. Craig makes a good point here. He's not saying, look, if you present these arguments, you're going to immediately convince people of your argument. I mean, some people you might, but most people are not going to want to follow the evidence and arguments at first. And so they may end up denying one or more of the premises. But again, the goal is to make them pay a high intellectual price for that. And we'll see as we start studying the arguments next week what that means, what that looks like. Okay, so let me pause here. Are there any questions or comments about why study apologetics before we move on to life is absurd without God? Okay, doesn't look like it, which is fine. I think that chapter is pretty straightforward. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a 5-minute animated video, which is exactly on the topic of, is life absurd without God? And it's a really, really well done video that someone actually did for William Lane Craig for this chapter in the book. So it's really a review of the chapter in 5 minutes. And then after that, I'll spend 30 more minutes explaining the chapter in the video.
Nobody asked me if I wanted to exist. Yeah, one day, boom, there you are. And you think to yourself, why am I here? Well, what do you think? Is there a reason we're here? Do our lives have any real significance?
Well, that depends.
On what?
On whether or not God exists.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that my life has no significance because I don't believe in God?
No, not at all. I'm saying that if God doesn't exist, it doesn't matter what you believe. Our lives would have no objective meaning, value, or purpose. Many atheists themselves recognize this. If atheism is true, life is absurd.
Okay, and why do they think that?
To begin with, if God does not exist, then the physical universe is all there is. Which means you and I are just accidental byproducts of nature.
Right. So?
That means we were not intentionally designed, so there's no purpose for us being here.
Whoa.
It gets worse. If God does not exist, there is no absolute standard of moral value. You've heard of Richard Dawkins, the atheist. He points out that in a materialistic universe, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference.
So you're saying atheists can't be good people?
No, I'm not saying that. Many atheists live good lives. What I'm saying is, atheism fails to provide an objective basis for saying any particular action is good or evil.
Oh, come on. After millions of years of sociobiological evolution, humans have developed a sense of morality. We all know it's good to feed a hungry child and bad to torture someone for fun.
Of course we do. But that's precisely what atheism cannot explain. If there's no God, then what we consider right or wrong is nothing more than an accident of evolution or a human social convention.
So what? I'm good with that.
Really? Evolution implies survival of the fittest, not morality. And social convention means that racism, intolerance, and cruelty are not really wrong. They just happen to be unpopular.
Okay, so atheists need to come up with some objective standard for rights and wrongs. How about this? If an action leads to human flourishing, then we can say it's objectively good. And if it doesn't, it's objectively evil.
But why think that human flourishing is good? Aren't you being species-centric? Why not refer instead to the flourishing of rats or cabbages?
Well,
And who gets to decide what contributes to human flourishing? Hitler was convinced killing millions of Jews would promote human flourishing. And Margaret Sanger thought forcing poor people to be sterilized would lead to human flourishing. As Guy Nielsen points out, pure practical reason will not take you to morality. So if atheism is true, there is no legitimate basis for saying that behaving one way is worse than behaving any other way. So it really doesn't matter how you live your life. Your day-to-day choices are meaningless.
That's depressing.
So if there's no God, what happens when you die?
Well, nothing. You simply cease to exist.
Right. So one person lives a kind, generous, thoughtful life. Another lives a horrible, violent, selfish life. It doesn't matter. In both cases, the outcome is the same: nothingness. So how can their life choices have any objective meaning?
Well, it's certainly meaningful if I discover a cure for cancer or save a child's life.
I agree completely. But atheism can't explain why. Scientists predict that eventually the whole universe and mankind with it will die out. So everything comes to nothing. That's why atheist Bertrand Russell says we must build our lives on the firm foundation of despair.
No thanks. I'd rather live a happy life.
You're not alone. Every atheist has to choose between being happy or being consistent. You can tell the whole world you're an atheist, but you can't really live like one.
Okay, so you're a Christian. If your God did exist, how would that change anything?
If Christianity is true, then each one of us is here for a reason. And life does not end at the grave. And God, He's the absolute standard of goodness. He knows you, He loves you, and He intentionally created you. So your life ultimately does have objective meaning, value, and purpose. That means you can live a life that's both happy and consistent.
Well, that doesn't prove Christianity's true.
Agreed. I'm simply pointing out that for Christians, living a life that is both happy and consistent is possible. For atheists, it's not. So what are you going to choose?
So if you read the chapter, that video basically condenses all the contents of the chapter into 5 minutes, and I think does a fantastic job. And of course, if any of you want the link to the video, just let me know in email afterwards. But I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so going back over it because even though the video did a good job, it was quick. So I want to spend some time and really hammer these points home because I think they're incredibly important. So if God, and we'll define God here as an all-powerful, perfectly good creator of the world who offers us eternal life. If God does not exist, then all human life, as well as every individual life, will eventually be destroyed. So if there is no God and no life beyond the grave, then life itself has no objective meaning, value, or purpose. So what I want to do now is carefully define what the word objective means, because when you discuss this with someone who's not a Christian, they will immediately tell you, oh, my life has meaning and my life has value and I have a purpose. And then they will give you a bunch of personal, subjective feelings about why their life has meaning, value, or purpose. And the point of this is not that you can't make up meaning, value, and purpose for your life. The point is that it doesn't objectively exist. So what do we mean by that? Well, objective means that it's independent of people's opinions. So it's true for all people at all times in all places. That's the definition of objective we're using. Whereas subjective means it's dependent on people's opinions, and it's only true for the person giving the opinion. So let's look at two sentences which I think are good examples of objective and subjective. So an objective statement would be the earth revolves around the sun. Now that is an objective fact. It is true for all people at all times and all places. But if I were to say strawberry is the best ice cream flavor, this is a subjective statement. It's just a statement about my opinion, about my feelings toward ice cream. Most of you probably don't think strawberry is the best ice cream flavor. And there would be no way to objectively adjudicate who's right, right? Because it's a personal preference. It's just a taste that I have. I prefer strawberry. You might prefer chocolate or vanilla or peach or whatever. But all of those are subjective opinions. Whereas if I say the earth revolves around the sun, that's an objective fact. It's true for all people, all times, and all places. All right, so let's talk about meaning. Without immortality, your life has no ultimate significance and makes no difference to the world's outcome. So if you die and there's no afterlife, and if everyone dies and there's no afterlife, then all of our lives have no ultimate significance. And my life makes no difference to the world's outcome whatsoever. Without God, there is no overarching framework within which man's life can be seen to matter. I mean, we are all, if God doesn't exist, we are all here just by accidental physical, chemical, biological processes. There is no meaning or purpose to our lives. We just accidentally arrived, because our parents had sex and we happen to be the result of that, and their parents the same thing. We're all here by complete random accident. There's no ultimate significance to why we're all here if God doesn't exist. So the way I see it is when you look up at the stars at night and you see the vast universe, you really have two main options, at least in Western civilization. Number one is I'm an insignificant speck in a vast universe that exists by accident. Or the Christian option is the same God who created the vast universe has given my life meaning. And I think the book is arguing that these are the two choices. Now, we're not dealing with Hinduism, Buddhism, and pantheist religions like that. We're just dealing with the two main candidates in the U.S. and the Western civilization, which is basically atheism or a practical kind of atheism, and people who believe in God. And these are the two options. And the point of the chapter is you're either one or the other. You're either an insignificant speck that exists by accident, or God created you and gave your life meaning. There's no third option. So this is I think, a powerful quote from the book. He says, if each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, then what ultimate meaning can be given to his life? Does it really matter in the end whether he ever existed at all? Sure, his life may be important relative to certain other events, but what's the ultimate significance of any of those events? If everything is doomed to destruction, then what does it matter that you influenced anything? Ultimately, it makes no difference. Okay, so this is my dog, Leo. I threw this picture in here. You're going to see Leo throughout the presentations over the next 8 weeks, because sometimes we need to lighten things up. And this material is very dense and can be difficult. So I like to throw pictures of Leo in here just so everyone can take like a mental brain break for a minute. But Leo always has something important to say that's appropriate to the lesson. And so for Leo, he says, well, the meaning of life is to eat everything you can fit in your mouth. That's exactly what he does. If he could fit anything in his mouth, he attempts to eat it. And that is his subjective meaning that he's given to his life. And if I meet someone who doesn't believe in God and they say, oh, well, the meaning to my life is, is to fight oppression. And that's what the meaning to my life is. In my mind, they're just like my dog. They've made up a meaning for their life, which is completely subjective. And Leo's meaning is no better or worse than their meaning. Okay, value. So if life ends at the grave, then it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as Stalin or Mother Teresa. Since your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior, you may as well just live as you please. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky put it, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. So if you're just going to die and there's no afterlife and you're just going to die and that's it, you get buried in a coffin and you rot away, then your destiny is completely unrelated to your behavior. So you could have been, Stalin, I think, lived to a ripe old age, and Mother Teresa did as well. But if God doesn't exist, if there's no afterlife, then their behavior didn't matter. They both have ended up in the exact same place. And so what point is there in living like Mother Teresa if that's the case? So without immortality, there is no moral accountability because there's no judgment. You just die and you're gone. And so your moral choices become inconsequential. Without God, moral values are just delusions ingrained into us by evolution and social conditioning. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, I'll keep going. So this quote is not in the book, but I really, really like it because I think this is a very honest atheist who understands the consequences of his worldview. His name is Michael Ruse. I think he's Australian, but he actually teaches down at Florida State University, or he used to. I don't know where he is now. But listen to what he says. He says the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than hands and feet and teeth. In other words, morality has evolved I should say moral feelings have evolved just like hands and feet and teeth have. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. In other words, they think they're referring to something that's objective. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. This is an honest atheist. And you saw in the video, they quoted several other atheists who completely agree with this position. So, I've interacted with atheists for 15 to 20 years. And, I point this out to them all the time. And they always say things like, oh, well, these scholars, they don't know what they're talking about. I can have objective meaning and value in my life. I don't have to listen to Michael Ruse. But as the video pointed out, they're just being inconsistent. I mean, Michael Ruse's position is consistent with his worldview. The atheist that says they can have objective meaning, value, and purpose without God is being inconsistent. All right, so what about purpose? Without immortality, your only destination is extinction in death. And without God, there is no purpose for which you came into this world. I mean, think about it. You can only have purpose given to you by another person. So if there is no God, if there's no person that created you, then you have no purpose. Again, you're here by accident. There is no reason why you're alive, and the universe could care less if you're alive or dead. You're just here by accident for no reason. So without God, you literally have no purpose for your existence. So without God, life would be without purpose, for man and the universe would then be simply accidents of chance, thrust into existence for no reason. Without God, the universe is the result of a cosmic accident, a chance explosion. There is no reason for which the universe exists or for which you and I exist, for that matter. It's really, to me, shocking to think about that, because everyone thinks that they're here for a purpose and everyone thinks that their life has meaning and that they have intrinsic value. And when you read this chapter, you really think about it. If God doesn't exist, that is all false. As for man, he is a freak of nature, a blind product of matter plus time plus chance. If God does not exist, then you are just a miscarriage of nature, thrust into a purposeless universe to live a purposeless life. Very depressing. So, it is impossible to live consistently and happily with an atheistic worldview. If we live happily as atheists, it is only by inconsistently affirming meaning, value, and purpose for our lives, despite the lack of foundation for them. If we live consistently as atheists, we shall be profoundly unhappy and even in despair, because we know our lives are really meaningless, worthless, and purposeless. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Francis Schaeffer, but he was a very well-spoken, intellectual Christian, wrote a bunch of books in the 1960s, 70s, maybe even 80s. And he had a lot of great insights about the world. And what he said was that modern man resides in what he called a two-story universe. And there was a picture of this in the book, which I'll show in a second. In the lower story is the finite world without God. So here life is absurd. But in the upper story, there's objective meaning, value, and purpose. Now, according to Schaeffer, modern man lives in the lower story because he believes there is no God, but he cannot live happily in such an absurd world. Therefore, he continually makes leaps of faith into the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose, even though he has no right to. So here's the illustration in the book I really like. So what he's saying is that modern man lives down here in the lower story because he doesn't believe in God. But he can't stand the fact that there's no meaning, value, or purpose, so he makes leaps into the upper story, leaps of faith. So the person who doesn't believe in God, you'll notice when you talk to them, they're constantly talking in terms of objective meaning, value, and purpose. They act as if their life has real meaning, and they act as if their life has value and purpose, but it doesn't. And so they just keep making these leaps of faith from the lower story to the upper story. So I found this illustration to be very, very helpful, and it kind of drives the point home as to how this whole dynamic works. So you may remember last summer we had these statues, and we had a bunch of people tearing statues down, and I wanted to talk about that for a minute. because this is a great example of modern man's inconsistency. So during the racial protests of 2020, many atheists and agnostics were knocking down statues of figures who lived centuries ago. They claimed that the people represented by the statues were racists and that racism is morally wrong. The problem is those people, as depicted in the statues, lived in a completely different time, place, and culture. So if there are no objective, meaning true for all people, all times, and all places, if there are no objective moral values which apply to people, to all people at all times and all places, then how can we judge the racism of someone who lived 200 years ago as objectively wrong? I mean, this is a perfect example of that leap into the upper story. On the one hand, they deny that there's an objective morality, but on the other hand, they're accusing people that lived 200 years ago in a completely different time, place, and culture of violating an objective moral law. So they're totally inconsistent. But you'll see this happen all the time. You'll see people who deny objective meaning, value, and purpose constantly affirming objective meaning, value, and purpose because they can't live life without doing that. They're inconsistent. So, what is the solution for atheists? Well, one proposal, which I thought was sad, comical, and shocking all at one time, is the noble lie. So, you might remember this from the book. So, a noble lie is one that deceives us, tricks us, compels us beyond self-interest, beyond ego, beyond family and nation and race. It is a lie because it tells us that the universe is infused with value, which is a great fiction, because it makes a claim to universal truth where there is none, and because it tells us not to live for self-interest, which is evidently false. But without such lies, we cannot live. So this professor at this conference was basically saying, look, we can't believe in God anymore. I mean, you know, this was toward the end of the 20th century, you know, we've outgrown religion. Religion is obviously wrong. Miracles can't happen. Science has disproven God, et cetera, et cetera. But we're in a lot of trouble because people need something beyond themselves. People need to have objective meaning, value, and purpose. So what we need to do is make up a story or a noble lie, which we will teach kids as they grow up so that they won't live lives of despair. I mean, this was a real proposal at a conference. So the solution for atheists was a noble lie. So this is the dreadful verdict pronounced upon modern man. In order to survive, he must live in self-deception. Truly depressing. Now, biblical Christianity challenges the worldview of modern man. Well, how so? According to biblical Christianity, God exists and life does not end at the grave. So we have a person, God, who can give all of our lives meaning, value, and purpose. And because he gives us eternal life, our lives matter. What we do here matters because it affects what happens to us in eternity. So biblical Christianity thereby affirms the two conditions sufficient for a meaningful, valuable, and purposeful life: God and immortality. Biblical Christianity therefore supplies a framework within which one can live both consistently and happily. So as we get to the end of this chapter and of these slides, you know, I always like to ask, so what? You know, why did we just talk about this for 30 to 40 minutes? I mean, for some of you, this is all like completely obvious. And you read this chapter and you're like, yeah, I know. Life is absurd without God. You know, who doesn't understand that? But a lot of people don't understand that. So I think the importance of this chapter is that many people are apathetic about the existence of God, but a discussion like this might shake them out of their apathy. And I've actually seen this in action. I've seen YouTube videos of evangelists talking to young people and asking them to consider the fact that they're going to die and that it's possible they'll be judged for their actions. And it's pretty interesting to watch their reactions. I mean, a lot of them at first are like, oh, I'm not worried about dying. But these evangelists really drive home the fact to these young people that you are going to die and it could happen at any moment. Your parents are going to die, your grandparents are going to die, your brothers and sisters are going to die. And, you know, it's really an effective strategy. I mean, it can be a little harsh in some ways because you're talking to them about their death, but it might shake them out of their apathy. So if the evidence for these two options, God existing versus not existing, are equal, a rational person ought to choose to believe in God. That is, if the evidence is equal, it seems to me positively irrational to prefer death, futility, and destruction to life, meaningfulness, and happiness. As Pascal said, we have nothing to lose and infinity to gain. So some of you may have heard of Pascal's wager, and we're not going to get into that, but that's basically what he was saying. If the evidence for atheism and Christianity are roughly equal, you should choose Christianity because you have infinity, you have eternity to gain. Whereas if you choose atheism, you just die and your life has no meaning, value, or purpose. Okay, so we have time for questions and discussion in a second. But before I forget, I just want to let you know for next week, go ahead and read chapter 3, which is why does anything at all exist? And that'll be the first deductive argument for God's existence. And by the way, I do want to warn you, chapter 3, in my opinion, is the most abstract argument in the entire book. So it is very difficult, in my opinion, to wrap your brain around. And I don't want you to get frustrated. If you read chapter 3, some of you might immediately get it. And you're like, yeah, this is obvious. I get this. And others of you are going to read it and really not understand it. And that's perfectly fine. I had to go back and read through this chapter several times to really understand it. Chapter 3 is one of those chapters, you'll read it, you'll think you understand it, and then when you try to explain it to someone, you'll realize you don't understand it at all. So it's a chapter you're going to have to wrestle with, but hopefully I'll help you with that next week. All right, so we have at least 5 more minutes, if not a little bit longer. So is there anybody that either had comments, wanted to say something about the chapter, or any questions for me about what I said or what was in the book? Okay, I don't see anybody with their hand raised. Or
you made it very clear, very, very good presentation.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. These first 2 chapters I thought were fairly straightforward. There's not a lot that's controversial. Well, it's controversial if you're an atheist. I mean, if you don't believe in God, you probably want to punch me out right now, because I've said repeatedly that your life is meaningless and purposeless. And that's pretty offensive if you say that to someone, in their face to face with you. But I think it's ultimately true. So if there are no questions, it's Wednesday night, it's almost 7:15. I don't want to keep everybody.
Billy, I want to just mention a couple quick things.
Sure.
I know you said you'd like me to chime in a little bit here and there. Just in the introductory chapter 1, on page 14, I kind of reacted to what he had just said, and then I had a thought, and then he kind of said it right beneath my critical thought of him. But I still think it's a little bit understated, and want to point it out to everyone that people, you want to have good arguments in support of your faith, and you're less likely to become quarrelsome or upset. But people you talk to will become upset because they're going to be convicted. And the important thing to remember is that you can only control your own attitude. You're never going to be able to control how people are going to react, which is why Billy's ready to be punched in the face for calling atheists meaningless. But that's what this is really about. I just want to point that out to you guys, that you want to be confident and know your stance, your beliefs, and the reasons for those beliefs. But just because you go through this study or study this for years does not mean you will not encounter people who become really emotional or heated in an exchange. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing I want to mention is that inconsistency is something that Billy talked about tonight. Logical inconsistency. That's I think that's a really good way, a subtle way. It will still get under some people's skin, but I think it's a good way to have a starting point to talk to people. Because I think sometimes we start to study this stuff and we go, where do I, start? Is there a place that's kind of organic and natural? And I know that, gosh, it's probably been a lot of years ago, but I remember giving a sermon about apologetics on one Sunday here at Cornerstone. And I talked about how you have to let, and this is some of what Billy already has said tonight, you have to let your worldview and their worldview collide. And you have to show them where they're colliding, because there's going to be a lot of times that little graphic he gave about jumping from lower to higher, from just the natural man to supernatural and God, meaning and purpose and all that stuff. People are doing that. You have to show them that they're doing that. You have to kindly point out to them why they become enraged or upset about things that are unjust. Well, they have a moral compass. Well, why do they have that? Because they're spiritual beings, and they may be telling you they're denying the existence of God or even the existence of objective truths, but then they're living in a way where they don't object to objective truth, and they're living in a way that they act like all these things are real and matter. And I think one of the examples I gave years ago in the sermon was it was a time when we were seeing a lot of violence in the news, which today we are again. And I said you can be looking at the news with somebody maybe you work with and see something that's upsetting, and you can ask them, well, if you believe that that's just one bag of biological stuff putting a hole into another bag of biological stuff, why does it bother you? Because if this is all just biological stuff and created from stardust, and matter acting upon time and chance, and I'm getting a little bit deep and mentioning all those things quickly, but if that's what the basis of their worldview is, then it is a legitimate question to ask, well, so why do you get upset when you see these things? And it's because they are suppressing the truth. And I know that Romans 1 is going to probably be mentioned in this book. I think it already has in the parts that I've read. But Romans 1 gives a little bit of guidance to a lot of people who do apologetics, and particularly those who are a little bit more reformed use this technique a lot. But Paul in Romans chapter 1, he talks about people know the truth, but they willingly suppress it. And the way the Greek works in that passage is kind of like if you were in a swimming pool and you were actively holding down like a beach ball that was filled with air and you weren't letting it come to the top to be seen. That's what he means when he says suppressing truth. So it's good to know. It's good to acknowledge those things that are biblical and factual, because you know that this is where people who are not believers, that's where their heart is, that's where they're coming from, whether they realize it or not. And so you need to be prepared that when you challenge those inconsistencies, they're going to become upset, very likely going to become upset, because they are actively suppressing what they know to be true. So that's all.
Thanks, Dennis. Mike Bullens, it looks like you put your hand up a couple minutes ago.
Yes, sir. So I got to thinking about this as Dennis was talking and what you shared, and the number of people that I could potentially be having these conversations with could be overwhelming. And I'm just wondering, how do you decide on where to start? You know, because based on what you're saying, you know, if you look at the idea of like C.S. Lewis, where you said they're typically very influential. Obviously, if we only are successful with certain people, we could potentially have a greater impact. Whereas if we get too involved with too many people, we may overwhelm ourselves and not accomplish anything. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, what I would do is talk to the people you have the best relationships with. If you have good relationships with people, then they will give you a hearing and they'll listen to you, as opposed to if you approach people that don't know you at all. So, I mean, when I talk to people, I always start with, you know, friends and family and people that are around me. And I found that I have very poor success when I try to talk to people that don't know me very well. And partially that's because I'm an engineer. I don't have great social skills. And I'm a little introverted and standoffish when I don't know a person. And so those aren't good personality traits when you're trying to win someone over. So, Mike, you strike me as a much nicer guy than I am. So you might have a lot better luck talking to people that don't know you that well. But for me, I have to build a relationship with someone for a while, and then I can start having these discussions with them. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And I do want to echo, you know, everything Dennis said. And, you know, one of the mistakes I made when I first learned this material, I was very excited about it. And I, let's say, launched into numerous apologetics attacks with friends and family. And those did not go well because my approach was very poor. I thought that I was just going to overwhelm them with my evidence and arguments, and it generally didn't work out that way. So after several years of being pretty in your face with people, I had to learn, you know, 1 Peter 3:15, right, says, do it with gentleness and respect. And I was missing gentleness and respect. I was just kind of being a know-it-all, and I had to stop doing that. So it's important to know the arguments, but it's equally as important to approach people with gentleness and respect. And not only is it biblical advice, but it's, you know, it basically won't work otherwise. I've tried it the other way, and it backfired many times. I was constantly having to apologize to people who I offended. And it's okay to offend people with the gospel. The gospel is offensive to modern man, but we don't want to add more offense on it than it already has, right? By being a jerk and not being nice to people. Anybody?
I think I just want to say real fast to Mike's question. How you start depends on your, what I call relational equity. How much of a relationship do you have with them? How much of a rapport have you built that's just genuinely about caring about them and not been anything about their belief system? And the other thing I would say that I know Billy did, probably a few years after he became a little bit less zealous. I don't know when he did this, but he had a group that he got together, and he asked them a lot of questions. Billy could probably tell you the name of the book or whoever it was that kind of encouraged him to do that. But he just asked them questions, and he never even gave them, here's what I think, until they asked him, which I thought was a really interesting method of.
Yes. That's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. We've invited a bunch of what I call seekers, people who are interested in Christianity but knew very little about it, to our house. They probably came, I don't know, 6 or 8 times. And each time they would come, I would ask kind of provocative questions. Well, what do you think about God? Or what do you think about evil? Or, there was a bunch of questions I asked them, and they would all go around the room and answer. And I would never give my opinion. And the people there's a book called Seeker Small Groups that came out years ago. Basically, the author said, don't give your opinion until they ask. And he warned in the book, he's like, it might take 2, 3, 4, 5 meetings before anyone asks your opinion, but they will eventually ask you, because you've been so kind. You've invited them to your home. You've listened to them. You haven't judged them. You've just let them ramble on and talk. And eventually they're going to want to ask your opinion. And it took about 3 sessions. I asked some question and everybody answered. And one guy went, hey, Billy, what do you think about this? We've never heard your opinion on it. And I was like, thank God the dam finally broke and I could actually tell them what I thought. But I earned that by listening. I mean, that's kind of the point of it, is I earned their respect by letting them talk and tell me what they believed for a long time before I jumped in and started giving my opinion. And, when you learn these arguments for God's existence and the why we can trust the Bible, etc., my inclination was to immediately jump on people in the first 5 minutes and barrage them with my apologetics artillery and tell them all the things that I knew. And again, that just doesn't work very well. It works much better if you ask them, well, what do they think about God, or where did the universe come from? Or, there's all kinds of questions you could ask, and you just let them talk and you listen to them and you try to understand what they really believe and where they're coming from. And the other nice thing about that is it takes all the pressure off of you, because you're not trying to win an argument. You're just listening to them. You're just letting them talk and letting them share their beliefs. And you can just sit back and relax and listen and take it all in. And eventually they'll be ready to hear your opinion. And that's when you can start giving it. So that approach worked really well in that situation. All right. we're at 7:24, so I'm thinking we should probably wrap it up. So I appreciate you all being on tonight, and we'll see how well I did next week. The number drop in half. Next Wednesday at 6:15. Well, there's 10 people on. Last week there were 30. Well,
We look forward to being in there next week, Billy.
I won't take it personally.
Thanks, Billy.
But please do read chapter 3. And again, it's very abstract. The arguments get a lot easier after chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the hardest chapter, in my opinion. After this, the arguments get more concrete and easier to follow. So don't get discouraged if you read chapter 3 and you're like, you got to be kidding me. What is this guy talking about? Don't worry. It gets better. All right.
Thank you, Billy, for your time.
Thanks,
Thank
Billy.
See you guys
Thank
next week.
you.
Billy.
Dan's hoping you'll have a quiz or something, or a mock-up, and and that's what Dan's really hoping for. So you make his day if you provided that, Billy.
All right. Oh, by the way, if anybody wants the slides, just let me know. I'll send them to you. Just email me.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so
All
much.
right.
All right.